Life on the Oregon Trail was both incredibly boring and extremely dangerous. Pioneers had to exercise extreme caution and a lot of bravado to cross the 2,170-mile stretch of land starting in Missouri and ending in Oregon. Accidents and disease were just waiting around the corner, but a majority of the trip was just spent trudging along next to the wagon. To say daily life on the Oregon Trail was difficult is a vast understatement. It was hard work and required uprooting your entire family and deciding to venture west for new opportunities, but that didn't stop thousands of people from emigrating and making the long journey. So what was daily life like on the Oregon Trail? It was dirty and cramped, but there also was a prevailing sense of enthusiasm and an adventurous spirit. These pioneers were making a trek into unknown territory, and even though they knew the risks, they still decided to face the danger head-on. Those who traveled through the Oregon Trail hailed from a range of different backgrounds, but most had a singular reason: opportunity. Though there was no guarantee of riches in the West, there was a chance anyone could make it big. In the mid-1840s, early westbound emigrants found gold in California. Stories flooded into the East promising the El Dorado of the West, sparking a surge in emigration beginning in 1849, properly named the California Gold Rush. Both men and women were caught up in the excitement. Luzina Wilson, a woman who traveled the Oregon Trail with her husband and 2 children, wrote, "The gold excitement spread like wildfire, even out to our log cabin in the prairie, and as we had almost nothing to lose and we might gain a fortune, we early caught the fever." Others caught the Oregon fever for other reasons too. Apart from the gold rush, there was continuous promise of a better life and land. In 1850, the U.S. Congress passed the Oregon Donation Land Act to encourage more migrants to move west. Under the act, every individual would be granted 320 acres of free land. It was such an incentive to travel that some people made the trip, got their land, then moved back east. In his book The Oregon Trail, Sketches of Prairie and Rocky Mountain Life, historian and writer Francis Parkman accounted his hunting trip across the first part of the Oregon Trail. He met many different people at the journey's beginning. The migrants ranged from persons of wealth and standing to some of the vilest outcasts in the country. Many families and migrants brought a stock of non-perishables and preserved foods. An emigrant from Missouri headed to San Jose, California, Newton G. Finley, wrote, "Our supply of food was bountiful, and of the best grade, also of great variety, consisting in part of cornmeal, flour, buckwheat flour, ham, bacon, sausages, dried beef, beans, peas, potatoes, rice, coffee, tea, sugar, honey syrup, milk, butter, dried fruits, apples, green, walnuts, hickory nuts, hazelnuts, etc. Others, however, were capable of having foods unavailable to most." Luzina Wilson wrote, "One luxury we hae which other emigrants nearly always lacked: fresh milk. From our gentle mully cow I never parted." Some emigrants made use of their own hunting abilities. Sarah Bird, who was only a young child when she made the trip across the Oregon Trail with her family, recounted in an oral history interview, "I can remember it all as plain as day, seeing them buffalo tear by, with their tails up and their heads close to the ground. There must have been 100 or more. That's a long way from 1,000,000, but the ground just shook as they went by. Some of the men got some good shots, and we had plenty of buffalo meat for a while. Meat was roasted by putting a big piece of tin in front of the fire. It was a sort of reflector. The meat was put between it and the fire, and you never tasted anything better than meat roasted that way. If any of those supplies ran out, however, there were trading posts where emigrants could get more food, or even trade their food for luxuries that were unavailable to them or their party." In his diaries, which covered his entire journey from Ottawa, IL, to California, Alonzo Delano was excited by the change of menu available to him when he reached Fort Laramie, a trading post in Wyoming. "On joining them, I was offered a piece of pie and cheese. Ye gods," he wrote. Pie, veritable dried apple pie, which Charlie Lewis made with his own hands. And although his own mother might have turned up her nose at it, 2 youths who had literally fed on the salt of the pork barrel for weeks, with pilot bread for a dessert, it was a perfect luxury. Food wasn't readily available for everyone, however, especially since not everyone packed well nor prepared and portioned their food for a 2,000-mile journey. Peter H. Burnett traveled from Missouri to Oregon, but he was part of a group who struggled to adapt to their new lifestyle. Our emigrants of the first portion of the trip were about as wasteful of their provisions as if they had been at home, he wrote. When portions of bread were left over, they were thrown away, and when anyone came to their tents, he was invited to eat. On July 24th, my father died, wrote J. Henry Brown in his autobiography. He had about recovered from the attack of fever caused by getting wet in the Platte, but caught cold and suffered a relapse without any hope of recovery. There was no physician in our or any available train. We were compelled to travel, and having no spring wagon along, the roughness of the road, with the heat of the weather greatly aggravated, sick the disease, and its progress was rapid. He died about midnight and was buried at sunrise in the morning. Disease was the top danger along the Oregon Trail. Of the approximate 350,000 people who traveled westward, an estimated 6–10% died due to disease. The prevalent form of illness was cholera, resulting from stagnant and polluted water. The disease was virulent and there was no cure. It would quickly attack a person's intestinal linings, cause diarrhea and vomiting, and usually kill the victim within the day they showed their first symptoms. The disease, however, was not unique to the trail. The world was facing a global cholera epidemic, and no one, including those not on the trail, knew that increased sanitation could prevent major outbreaks. Dysentery was another common disease, also caused by paltry and unsanitary conditions. Unlike cholera, however, there was a cure, and catching it wasn't a certain death. A person could have survived if they were treated with castor oil. Other diseases also plagued the trail, including measles, mountain fever, scurvy, smallpox, food poisoning, and pneumonia. But they were not nearly as problematic or deadly to the Oregon Trail migrant as cholera or dysentery. The Oregon Trail was an arduous path, but it was one of the safest means to travel westwards as long as migrants paid attention to all the potential natural hazards. The whole journey could take anywhere between 5 months to a year, crossing through the Great Plains, the Platte River, and the Rocky Mountains, each section having its own perils and dangers. To minimize the possible dangers, most expeditions and caravans left Independence, Missouri at the end of winter, with the coming of the first blades of grass. Leaving at the beginning of spring made it less likely for travelers to experience terrible winter conditions, but it did present other problems. Anyone on the Oregon Trail was required to cross the northern Platte River in Wyoming. The river, at one of its most popular crossings, was 100 to 200 yards wide and 10 feet deep at its deepest point. Because of the time of year migrants were traveling, however, they would often reach the Platte River crossing in June, when spring runoff was at its peak. There were ferries that would take people across the river, but they charged for every wagon and every count of livestock. Many travelers couldn't afford the fee or felt they could cross without paying for the ferry. Though it worked sometimes, others weren't so lucky. Luzina Wilson and her party attempted to cross the river without a ferry, and though they took proper precautions, they couldn't escape the river's powerful current. Water poured into their wagon, sweeping away some of their provisions while their livestock drowned. They went out of sight inch by inch, she wrote, and the water rose over the moaning beasts. Without a struggle, they disappeared beneath the surface. In a little while, the broad South Platte swept on its way, sunny, sparkling, placid, without a ripple to mark where a lonely man parted with all his fortune. Along the trail, migrants would run into deer, elk, wolves, and bear. Among other animals, some of the most unexpectedly dangerous, however, were the American bison. Bison, also mistakenly referred to as buffalo, travel in small bands across the Great Plains, but they tend to congregate into larger herds during the spring and fall. Those herds could come towards migrant camps quickly and unexpectedly, leaving little time to get out of their way. Sarah Bird, though only a child when she and her family traveled the Oregon Trail, remembered the panic that arose at her camp when they saw bison in the distance. It was dusk, and we'd gone into camp when all at once, way off in the distance, we see a big cloud of dust, she said. It come nearer and nearer, and pretty soon somebody yelled, "It's buffalo. Looks like 1,000,000 of 'em, and they're comin' this way." Mebbe there wasn't a fuss then. Everybody was shoutin' to everybody else and givin' orders and rushin' round like crazy people. Some of the men got out on horses, and some way or nother, what with their yellin' and wavin' whatever they could get hold of, they kept the buffalo from comin' through the camp. Though 1,000,000 bison was an exaggeration, the ground still shook as the hundreds of bison were steered away. Independence was the common rendezvous for anyone planning to travel the Oregon Trail. According to Francis Parkman, a traveler of the Oregon Trail, the landing was some miles from the river in the extreme frontier of Missouri. Opportunity brought people from all over the United States and Europe to the shores of the Missouri River, where they waited for the first day of spring. On the muddy shore stood some 30 or 40 dark, slavish-looking Spaniards, wrote Parkman, gazing stupidly out from beneath their broad hats. They were attached to one of the Santa Fe companies, whose wagons were crowded together on the banks above. In the midst of these, crouching over a smoldering fire, was a group of Indians, belonging to a remote Mexican tribe. 1 or 2 French hunters from the mountains, with their long hair and buckskin dresses, were looking at the boat. And seated on a log close at hand were 3 men with rifles lying across their knees. Leaving Independence, people traveled in companies which would range wildly in total population. One of the first major wagon trains was led by missionaries Marcus and Narcissa Whitman in 1843, who lead 1,000 settlers westward. The number greatly increased by the late 1840s, when at least 50,000 people traveled on the Oregon Trail every year. In 1848, the Wanna Company left Independence with approximately 20 wagons, which would have extended about a half-mile from the first wagon to the last. According to the diary of Riley Root, who traveled the Oregon Trail in 1850, it was safest to travel with anywhere between 10 to 25 wagons, though there were definitely cases that exceeded that number. J. Henry Brown's wagon train consisted of anywhere between 13 to 40 wagons, but they were a very picturesque sight. The white covers of the wagons and new tents resembled a small village, while the campfires shed their ruddy light on the surrounding darkness, with its ever-changing hues and making the increasing darkness still more impenetrable. It was up to each company how to organize the group. Some were loosely governed, while others were set up with their own constitution or charter, or adhere to the rules set up by the leader or driver of the company. According to the personal journal of Captain Solomon Tehero, a wagon train master in 1845, their constitution had listed articles to elect a president, secretary, and treasurer among other positions, as well as articles for the amount of cattle a person could bring, the fees each person must pay, and the resources they must bring. One of the greatest fears for many of the migrants were Native American peoples. There were a plethora of different Native American cultures along the trail, including the Sioux, Crow, Shoshone, and Ute. But most of the fear was fueled by stories generated amidst combat in multiple wars and skirmishes, which generalized violent interactions as the norm. When migrant Luzina Wilson first encountered Native Americans, she feared for her and her family's lives. I had read and heard whole volumes of their bloody deeds, the massacre of harmless white men, torturing helpless women, carrying away captive innocent babes, she wrote. I felt my children the most precious in the wide world, and I lived in an agony of dread that first night. These stories, however, proved untrue for the majority of people traveling the Oregon Trail. The Indians were friendly, of course, Wilson continued, and swapped ponies for whiskey and tobacco with the gathering bands of emigrants. But I, in the most tragi-comic manner, sheltered my babies with my own body and felt imaginary arrows pierce my flesh 100 times during the night. Her fear proved unfounded. Peter Hardeman Burnett had encounters with Native Americans multiple along his travels in 1843. He writes of a Cheyenne chief who he meets at Fort Laramie. The chief boasted that they had never shed the blood of the white man, and even faced by provocations and insults of a foolish, rash young man. He was a clear-headed man. Other Native Americans whom he wrote of kept at a distance and never manifested any disposition to molest them in any way, while others further, like those at Salmon Falls on Snake River, traded with the emigrants. Though it wasn't unheard of for some altercations between emigrants and Native Americans, they were rare and often proved more dangerous to Native Americans than migrants. Between 1840 and 1860, Native Americans killed 362 emigrants, while emigrants killed 426 Native Americans. Furthermore, emigrants proved far more problematic towards the Native American settlements than the other way around. Emigrants tended to overgraze the prairies, cut down woodlands they came across, and overhunted many of the animals necessary to sustain the livelihood of many Native American communities. Though the statistics vary greatly, death was nonetheless a common occurrence on the Oregon Trail. Of the 200,000, 500,000 people who traveled along the trail, and estimated 20,000 to 30,000 of them died. Though the causes of death were numerous, the most were caused by disease, improper sanitation, and accidents. Accidents took many forms along the trail, but it includes drowning, accidental shootings, and injuries from mishandling livestock or wagons. One of the most tragic deaths was recorded in multiple sources. Absalom Hardin and J. Henry Brown both traveled on the Oregon Trail in 1847, and both tell the story of an 8-year-old boy, Richard Harvey, who lost balance standing on the wagon tongue while trying to get in. He fell below the wagon's wheel and killed him immediately. According to Brown, they consigned him to rest with a boot box for a coffin the same night, but kept traveling up the Platte River. Beyond the emotional toll that death commonly presents, burial of the deceased posed another problem for immigrants. Statistically speaking, there are 10 burials to every mile of the Oregon Trail. Practically speaking, however, many had to be buried where they passed. Many cemeteries can still be found today. In 2015, archaeologists from the University of Wyoming excavated 3 skeletons of 2 women and an adolescent boy. They were found within view of a spring and a stand trees well known to be a resting spot along the trail, buried under earth and a large piece of wood. Thanks for watching, guys, and don't forget to subscribe our channel.